We've got teams bullying their way into the top 10 after dominating performances, as well as teams flying out of there in a hurry after shitting the bed, and that's part of what makes the NFL so great. With that being said, let's take a look at all 32 teams and where they stand in my power rankings as we head into Week 4 of the 2024 NFL season, right after... Alright folks, with Week 3 officially in the books, that means the Cole Breaks the Huddle CBTH power rankings have got to be updated. There was some wild games, man, a lot of shakeups this week, so without further ado, let's just get right into this. For the first time this year, we have a new worst team, so congrats to the Tennessee Titans for falling below the Panthers, a feat many thought would be about as impossible as Will Levis playing a game without a wild turnover. But thanks to that man and his 8 total turnovers, including another pick 6 against the Packers this past week, the Titans fell to 0-3 and also fell to 32 on the power rankings. The Red Rifle Andy Dalton, though, got the start over Bryce Young this week for Carolina, and he lit up the Raiders like a Christmas joint, blowing them out 36-22, but were up 33-7 at one point. And this sadly appears to confirm that Bryce Young was indeed a large part of the Panthers' problem on offense, and while this is just 1 week against a subpar opponent, we'll see if they can keep it going next week against the reeling 0-3 Bengals. Speaking of 0-3 teams, the Jags find themselves at 30 on this list after getting demolished by the Bills on Monday Night Football. Trevor Lawrence has lost 8 consecutive starts in a row going back to last season, and they're well on their way to getting Doug Peterson fired. Another coach in the hot seat is Brian Daboll, who did buy himself some time this week after the Giants beat the Browns on the road. The defense tightened up this week, and Malik Neighbors certainly looks the part. That dude is a dog. But as long as Danny Dumps is the QB, it's hard to feel, very confident about this team. I have the Patriots next at 28, and they're coming off a blowout loss against Aaron Rodgers and the Jets. They upset Cincy in Week 1, but are starting to fall in line with where many people expected them to be this season. They have the second fewest points in the league, and aside from Ramondre Stevenson, there's really nothing on that offense to get excited about. I'm just hoping we see Drake May sooner rather than later. At 27 is the Bears. They lost to the Colts this week, and even though he threw 2 interceptions, Caleb Williams looked improved from weeks 1 and 2. They're clinging to a top 10 defense at the moment, but with how bad that O-line is, it's going to be tough sledding for this team moving forward. With all the weapons on that offense, though, I'd love to see Caleb Williams start to ball out a bit more. The Raiders are next, finding themselves on the wrong end of a blowout against the Panthers. Pretty freaking surprising, and I couldn't think of a weirder way to follow up their upset win over the Ravens. The previous week, they're 27th in points allowed, dead last in rushing yards, and don't have a dependable quarterback, which basically means they are not good. Now, at 25, I have the Browns, and look, you could really make a case for any of these teams between like 31 and 23 to be higher or lower. All of them are rather subpar at best through 3 weeks of football, but I have Cleveland here for now, and even though their defense is currently ranked 20th in points allowed, I think that number is a bit inflated because of their Week 1 blowout to the Cowboys, and over the course of the season, I expect them to improve. I also think they're going to have to bite the bullet eventually and start Jameis Winston, but man, that QB situation is a nightmare right now. Deshaun Watson is boasting some of the worst QB stats we've seen in quite some time through his first 3 games this year. Next up, a team that had some bad quarterback play weeks 1 and 2 are actually coming off of a pretty impressive win over the Bucs. That's the Denver Broncos winning 26-7, and Bo Nix played his best game by far as a pro. Believe it or not, their defense is 6th in points allowed, so if Bo Nix can keep progressing throughout the season, they could potentially be a team on the rise. Now, the Dolphins are a tough team to figure out. Sure, they're 1 and 2 and just got blown out by the Seahawks, but that's because Tua Tagovailoa is currently on IR after suffering that recent concussion. Another one to add to the pretty long list of concussions he's had over the last few seasons, and it's hard to know because of that how long he's going to be out. Plus, backup Skylar Thompson is now day-to-day with a rib injury. They just signed Tyler Huntley, though, and he's probably an improvement over Skylar Thompson. But again, that man just got here. Plus, they have a ton of weapons on offense, and with Mike McDaniel at the helm, I feel like 23 is a good spot for them while their QB situation is a big, fat question mark. The Colts have a good QB at times. They finally got their first win of the season over the Bears after back-to-back one-score losses against the Texans and Packers. They have the 13th ranked defense and 17th ranked offense, which isn't bad by any means, but Anthony Richardson has really been struggling, up and down, to say the least. He leads the league in interceptions, and that's been killing them like Kenny in a typical episode of South Park. However, if he can limit the turnovers, I think they can be a dangerous team for sure. Now, this is another weird one. The Bengals are 0-3, despite having a top 15 offense in terms of both yards and points. Burrow and Jamar Chase had that typical connection for the first time this season, over 100 yards and 2 scores for Chase. But their defense has been lackluster, especially this week, giving up 38 points to the Commanders on Monday Night Football. It almost feels wrong having the Bengals this low, but this is as high as I can possibly put an 0-3 team that talks as if they are 3-0 and have actually done something with their miserable franchise in the postseason. So next, that's going to be to the Cardinals, who are at 20 this week, and I think they're a better team than their 1-2 record would suggest. They played the Bills in week 1, then Detroit this past week, 2 of the best teams in the league. Their offense has looked great for the most part, 7th in yards and 4th in points, but their defense definitely needs some work. Another bird is 1 spot ahead of them, and that is the Atlanta Falcons. 3 really tough games to start the year. Pittsburgh and that #1 defense in their season opener, then the Eagles and Philly on Monday Night Football, and the Chiefs at home last week. All of them have been 1-score games, and even though Kirk has looked better the last couple of weeks, I still don't think that offense is fully in sync yet. The Rams are interesting because of all the injuries they've had. Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, John Johnson. The O-line has been completely demolished due to the injury bug, so it makes sense they got blown out by Arizona in week 2. We saw what an almost fully healthy Rams team kind of looked like in week 1 when they took the Lions to overtime. And then this past week, they beat the 49ers in a really impressive win. As long as they have Stafford at QB and McVay at coach, this could be a fringe playoff team, especially once they get healthy. Next up at 17, I have the Commanders, who are coming off a huge dub on the road in Cincinnati. Jaden Daniels looks legit. He leads the league in completion percentage, and their offense is 5th in points, 6th in yards, and 6th in third down conversion percentage. On top of that, they haven't punted a single time in back-to-back games, which is just a crazy stat. The only problem is their defense is pretty suspect, giving up over 29 points a game. They are 2-1 though, and it may be a 3-horse race in the NFC East between them, the Eagles, and the Cowboys. Now, I have the Chargers at 16. Jim Harbaugh has that team playing extremely hard right now, and they're really taking on the identity of a Harbaugh-led team, especially in the run game. They've given up the 3rd fewest points in the league on defense, and are 7th in rushing, with J.K. Dobbins having the 3rd most rushing yards in the NFL right now. Their biggest concern, though, is injuries. Seems to happen every year. Justin Herbert just re-aggravated his ankle injury in a loss to the Steelers that he suffered the week before. He left the stadium in a walking boot. He did practice today, but on top of that, even if he plays, he could be playing without his starting right tackle in Joe Alt. He has an MCL sprain. And his starting left tackle and Rashawn Slater with a pec strain. Then on defense, Derwin James is suspended for 1 game, and outside linebacker Joey Bosa already is banged up with a hip injury, and that's also part of the reason why I dropped them down this far. Then the Cowboys dropped again from 12 to 15 after losing to the Ravens at home, though they made it interesting late and almost came back. This is the most Jekyll and Hyde team I've ever seen. You blow out the Browns week 1, get blown out by the Saints week 2, start to get blown out week 3, but come back and lose by 3. They can't run the ball. They're 30th in rushing yards, but Dak leads the league in passing yards, and their offense is 6th in scoring. I thought Mike Zimmer would have that defense playing better, but through 3 weeks, they've given up almost 30 points per game, which is not a recipe for long-term success. I expect them to make the playoffs, but if they don't turn things around, they aren't going to make it looking like they have. The Bucs took a tumble from 7 to 14 this week after getting stomped by the Broncos. This was ugly and one of the most surprising games of the week, in my opinion. They just beat Detroit on the road and were looking like a real powerhouse, but got their power unplugged by the Denver Broncos of all teams. Now, they are still 2-1, but I think sliding down 7 spots is fair punishment for getting smoked by the team they just did. The Jets are next at 13. They actually didn't move despite blowing out the Patriots on Thursday Night Football. But the Patriots are not good, and this also has more to do with a bunch of teams moving around them. Aaron Rodgers had that offense humming this week, to be fair, against a pretty good Patriots defense, and that performance put the defense of the Jets in the top 10 in terms of points allowed. Garrett Wilson and Allen Lazard look like a great duo at receiver. Then they have one of the best 1-2 punches in the backfield with Breece Hall and Braylon Allen. They've executed in crucial situations too. They're actually 1st in third down percentage and 3rd in red zone TD percentage, and could definitely be a team on the rise in the next few weeks. Now, I have the 49ers dropping all the way from 2 to 12. I didn't want to overreact after their loss to the Vikings last week because the Vikings are really freaking good, but after a tough loss against the Rams and with all the injuries they have, including Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey is in Germany getting treatment on his Achilles, and now Purdy is dealing with back soreness. I think 12 is a fair spot for them at the moment, though if they can get healthy, we all know they'll likely make another deep playoff run. The Saints offense fell back to earth this week against the Eagles, losing 15-12 in a game that I really thought was going to be a shootout on offense. The encouraging thing to take away from that game is their defense held Philly to just 15 points, and they're still a top 5 unit. A discouraging takeaway, though, is that they lost their center Eric McCoy to a hamstring injury, and he's expected to miss 6 to 8 weeks because of it. They've got 3 tough games coming up on their schedule as well, 2 against division rivals and 1 against the Kansas City Chiefs, so we should have a much clearer picture of where this team is after week 6. From here, let's move into the top 10. Starting us off at number 10 is going to be the Seattle Seahawks. They were at 15 last week, and I know they haven't exactly played against the toughest competition, but they're 3-0 with the rest of their division sitting at 1-2. They have a top 10 offense and a top 5 defense, and even though Kenneth Walker has been out with injury, Zach Charbonnet has looked just fine in his absence, and the offense hasn't missed a beat. They play in Detroit on Monday Night Football this week, and I am definitely looking forward to that one, and a win against the Lions will definitely move them up even further. The Ravens are going to be staying put at 9 after beating the Cowboys this week. I know they're 1-2, and that Raiders loss was a bad one. I mean, it was really ugly, but I think they're going to start clicking now, in theory. They lead the league in total yards, and Derrick Henry's massive game against Dallas helped propel them to the 2nd most rushing yards as a team. They play the Bills on Sunday Night Football this week, and that should be a banger. If they can find a way to win that one, it would give them a ton of momentum from there, move them up a bit more on the power rankings as well. The problem is the Bills really look the part at the moment, so best of luck to Baltimore. Now, the Packers made another big jump, a Lambo leap, if you will, moving from 17 all the way to 8. When Jordan Love went down with the MCL sprain in week 1, I thought they were going to look cooked, but give credit to Matt LaFleur for finding ways to win with Malik Willis at QB, who's also playing pretty well. Their ground game has been dominant. They lead the league with 204 rushing yards per game. They're 12th on defense, are tied for the 5th most sacks, and are holding teams to just 28% on third downs, which is the 6th best rate in the league. I know they've only beaten the Colts and Titans, but they've positioned themselves to hit the ground running when Jordan Love comes back, which could be as soon as this week against the Vikings, but we shall see about that. You want to talk defense? The Pittsburgh Steelers have a soul-crushing defense that has carried them to a 3-0 record. They've given up just 8.7 points per game. No, that's not a typo. 8.7 points per game, which is 1st in the league. 229 yards per game, 1st in the league. They've held teams to just 21.8% on third downs, also 1st in the league. Their offense, on the other hand, is nothing truly special. Pickens is a dog, but Justin Fields is he's doing okay. He's managing the game well and allowing them to lean on their defense, and they only have 1 turnover so far, which is pretty impressive and I think a key to some of their wins. As long as they can keep suffocating offenses with their defense and play clean on the offensive side of the ball, they're going to win a lot of ugly games this year. Speaking of ugly games, the Texans played one hell of an ugly game this week against the Vikings, getting blown out 34-7. I've mentioned it before, but that O-line is not great, and CJ Stroud is tied for the 5th most sacks taken in the league. And that's really their biggest weakness because they have weapons all over the place on offense. And even though that game against Minnesota got away from them, they're still giving up the 4th fewest yards on defense. So I expect them to bounce back against the piss-poor Jags this week. With all that being said, and with that, we've got to move into the top 5. The Eagles are going to hold spot number 5 for me, moving up 1 from last week after beating the Saints this week. They're 2-1, but are a Saquon drop away from being 3-0. That offense is pretty scary. They're 3rd in rushing and 5th in passing, and they have all kinds of weapons at their disposal. Sort of. The kicker is A.J. Brown hasn't been available the last couple of games with a hamstring injury and will probably be out again this week. And Devontae Smith suffered a concussion against New Orleans, and I'd be surprised if he plays this week as well. So they have weapons, but they're a couple of the main ones are pretty banged up right now. The good news for the Eagles, though, is that they have an early bye in week 5, so if they can find a way to beat Tampa this week, they should be getting those guys back healthy in week 6. Now, at number 4, I have the Detroit Lions, who are coming off a win over the Cardinals, bouncing back from their week 2 loss against the Bucs. Their defense is a top 10 unit, and even though their offense hasn't been putting up the points they were last year, they've still been able to move the ball successfully with just under 400 yards a game, which is 4th in the league. They just need to start converting in the red zone because right now they're 26th in the league in red zone scoring percentage, which is their biggest weakness. If they can fix that, though, they're once again contenders in the NFC, and honestly, even if they don't fix it, they probably still are. A surprise contender in the NFC is the Minnesota Vikings. I had them at 10 last week, which felt extreme, but they beat the Niners and were 2-0, so it felt justified. Well, they just eviscerated the Texans 34-7. And when you look at these stats, you'll see why they are at number 3. They're 3rd in points per game as well as on third downs. They're also 7th in red zone scoring. Sam Darnold leads the NFL in touchdown passes, and they haven't even had Jordan Addison for the last 2 games, or TJ Hawkinson, who is still working his way back from his torn ACL last year. Then on defense, they've given up the 2nd fewest points per game and lead the NFL in sacks with 16. I mean, good God, this team is rolling right now. Editor Troy, who's editing this video right now, really enjoys that fact, and they've beaten 2 great teams. Now, they do have another big challenge this week as they take on their biggest rival, the Packers in Green Bay, but I do have them favored to win that game. Now, at number 2, I have the Bills, who some are favoring to even be number 1 on the power rankings, but as we'll see when I talk about number 1, can't do that yet, Chiefs bias aside. The Bills, though, blew out the Dolphins in week 2 and then just blew out the Jags in week 3, with Josh Allen playing some of the best football of his life. He has 7 passing touchdowns and 2 rushing touchdowns through 3 weeks, and he has yet to commit a single turnover, which has always been his biggest knock. I think he had a fumble early on, but I do not believe it was actually lost. They have the highest scoring offense in football as well, despite losing Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis. Plus, their defense is only giving up 16 points per game. I thought they were going to maybe take a bit of a step back, still be a playoff team, but take a step back this year after losing some of those key pieces. But they haven't missed a beat, and they still look like the biggest challengers to stop KC from completing the three-peat right now. And that brings us to numero uno, the aforementioned back-to-back defending Super Bowl champions, the Kansas City Chiefs. They're 3-0, and I know all those games have been one-score games, heart racing down to the wire, one-score games that could have gone either way. But until they actually lose a game, it's basically impossible for me to drop them from being number 1. Mahomes is off to a shaky start this year, though, throwing 5 touchdowns and 4 picks. But we saw this movie last year. The offense sputtered at times, and they looked really bad in some games, but figured it out down the stretch and won another freaking Super Bowl. Rashee Rice, though, looks to have surpassed Travis Kelce for the time being as that number 1 target, and he's 2nd in the NFL in receiving yards, 1st in receptions, and 1st in yards after the catch. Carson Steele played well as his first game, being the true number 1 running back with Pacheco out, and with Kareem Hunt now joining the active roster, I think the run game should be just fine until Pop gets healthy. Love it or hate it, the Chiefs are still the team to beat as they rely heavily on Spags and his defense at times, but it doesn't matter. They find this way to get really stressful W's and therefore once again remain at the top of this list. Let me know your thoughts on these power rankings. Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? There's going to be a lot of movement either way in these rankings after all these games this week because the NFL is just insane right now and you absolutely love to see it. But that's it for these rankings, and with that, I'll see y'all next time.